So it is my absolute pleasure to be welcoming Dr. Lisa Hamm, whose presentation is called Learning to See. Lisa, it's great that you can be with us. We're very excited to have you here. And I know that everybody is going to be enthralled by what you will have to share. I also know that Lisa has prepared a great introduction to who she is and where she is from. So without further ado, Lisa, please start when you are ready.
Thank you so much, Kia ora Sue. I'll share my presentation here. Kia ora Sue. It's absolutely lovely to be here today. It's nice to see Sue's face and Trudy's face and Sharon's. It's nice to know that I have a couple of friends out there among the black boxes that make up the Zoom world. Hopefully by the end of this week, I'll know a few more of you. I've really enjoyed getting to hear those of you that I've heard speak so far. And I think there's so many overlapping things I would love to chat with you about. Hopefully we get that opportunity. I know relationships often start with sharing our own stories, so I'll just share a little bit about myself. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Canada te moto, ko ungui hara te tenga te tohu whenua, ko ungui hara te awa, ko Mennonite te iwi, ko Lisa toko ingoa, nā rira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I am from Canada. I grew up in a region that the First Nations Haudenosaunee people called Ongui Hera. Excuse me. By the time my ancestors moved to this land, Ongui Hera had sort of morphed into this word Niagara. So I grew up on the Niagara River, by the bit of it that is sort of quiet and peaceful downriver from the relatively famous Niagara Falls. So if you've been to that part of the world or you plan to go, if you see the falls, which is probably sort of the most notable part about that region, I really encourage you to drive a little bit or travel a little bit downriver to a little town called Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is where I'm from. It's quite a quaint, beautiful town. And I'm sure my parents would take you in. They're very good about their hospitality. A little bit more about me. I don't have any lived experience with visual impairment. My vision developed typically. My mom, though, has progressive myopia, and she has a lot of the associated macular disease that if you were in Rebecca and Jenny's talk yesterday, she mentioned that when myopia is progressive, that there can be all kinds of damage to the retina, early cataracts, those sorts of things, which is the situation that my mom is in. So growing up around that, I guess I had a sense that people could perceive the world differently. And then I think the point where I learned that animals had often quite a whole different set of sensors to understand information around them than we did, that our senses could be different from other animals. It kind of blew my mind. And I think what we use to understand the world around us, I think to me started to sort of feel maybe a bit arbitrary, I guess, for lack of a better word. So despite knowing that vision can be a flawed and incomplete way to know the world around us, I do still have all the normal sighted people biases. For example, I love using images and videos, and I'm known sometimes to use low contrast things, which because I like the way that they look or something. So I'll apologize for that in advance. But in this presentation today, although I do include some images and videos, all of that information is really peripheral, and I'll say all of the important points to the best that I can out loud verbally. Yeah, so that's a little bit of an introduction about me. I wanted to say how much I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to be at this conference in general. I certainly don't see myself as an expert for this group of people. I have no background in education, and I appreciate that perspective so much that it's been really lovely to be a part of this, and I'm much more interested to learn than to share today. So far, yesterday it was just a lovely day. I learned from Ellen and Stephanie, I think, that F words can be fantastic. I was pleasantly surprised to hear that there were some fellow Canadians involved in developing this quite nice way of empowering families to talk to schools and clinicians. Rebecca and Jenny, I don't know how you guys, if you were in that talk, but man, it made me sit up straight in my seat and worry about tech neck, something that I hadn't worried about before. Amanda's talk yesterday, it really blew me away. Her thoughtful discussion about the role of sound in learning about the world. Amanda, I hope I'm getting your remembering your name right, but man, that talk was just fascinating. And Kay, oh, it was beautiful to hear your warm heart just really shine through as you gave that talk yesterday. And I really appreciated how you really considered everyone who is listening to that talk and using story, I think, to encourage everyone. I would love to have a mentor like the one Anne Sullivan had through those letters. And so beautiful to see. Also really enjoyed the panel discussion. Particularly interested in the nods that were made during that discussion to equity and access to technology as people are navigating no or low vision in different parts of the world. And I think a lot of those things that were discussed yesterday have overlaps with the kinds of things that I've been thinking about. So I'll share some of that with you today, and hopefully we have a chance to explore those overlaps at some point in the next couple of days. I didn't get to go to all the talks, so I'm sure there was lots of other ones in other streams that were fascinating too. Oh, and just generally, I really appreciate how all these talks have been so clear. Educators, fantastic at communicating. I think education conferences just must be the best all the time. So today I've entitled my talk, Learning to See, and I'm hoping to kind of pique your interest in this idea that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. So my academic background is interdisciplinary. Like I said, it doesn't have education as part of it. It's a little bit more in the sciences. So I did a degree in sort of community health sciences, but then in more basic neuroscience. I studied retinitis pigmentosa in the retina, did some sort of biochem research in that domain. And then also worked on more sort of systems level neuroscience. So all of this stuff was about how the brain was about how we understand, or how vision works, both from the retinal perspective and then from the higher order kind of visual processing in the brain perspective. But although my academic experience has been in that domain, I feel like I've learned so much from the community organizations that I've been involved with over the years. And they've probably shaped my thinking about vision and about this talk today, probably more than some of my academic experience. So I'll just introduce to you some of those organizations. I volunteered with the Kilimanjaro Center for Community Ophthalmology. Their logo is just on the screen on the left there. I've kind of volunteered off and on since 2008, I guess. And then I worked as a low vision specialist for the Canadian Institute for the Blind for several years. And then just recently, I've started to insert myself into Blends a little bit to try to learn from their staff and students about this experience of living with low vision. And in particular, because my background is a little bit more in the neuroscience side, understanding whether that perspective could have any value for the kinds of challenges that are being raised within these organizations. So that's kind of led me to some projects that are related to brain-based visual impairment. I think it was Beth who gave a talk yesterday about CBI. You did a great job, Beth, of highlighting all the different terms that we might use in that domain. And so I think the idea of children who have CBI or different kinds of brain-based visual impairments and more complex needs that have a neurodevelopmental aspect are things that I'm quite interested in. I recently, or a couple of years ago, got some funding from the Royal Society Te Aparengi in order to do some research on childhood brain-based visual impairment. And sort of, I think part of what they were interested in is perhaps trying to bridge some of the communication gaps between people working within community settings, like the organizations, perhaps that I have on the screen here, and those people who are working in the lab and spending a lot more time at computers reading and writing, which had been my life a little bit more recently. Excuse me. I think that this has come up in a few of the talks yesterday. This idea of and I think part of the theme for the conference really is how we communicate with each other from these different perspectives. So because I have some experience, particularly at CNIB, and then also some experience on the more clinical medical side. I think we use quite different words sometimes, and sometimes that language can be challenging to really make the information coming from all of these different perspectives synergistic in order to really help kids moving forward. So I'm just interested to be in that space, I guess. So the specific project that I'm going to talk to you about today is just a really small part of the larger project that I've been working on. And this particular project was initiated through the Kilimanjaro Center for Community Ophthalmology. So I'm going to introduce to you a few of the people who were really key in initiating this project through the years. They're not here today, so I'll give a little introduction of who they are. So I have a picture of Robert on the left. He's one of the directors of KCCO, Kilimanjaro Center for Community Ophthalmology. The photo in the middle is of myself with Praskovia and Elizabeth. Elizabeth is in the middle of the photo in a red t-shirt. She's the childhood blindness coordinator for East Africa at KCCO. And Pras, the woman on the left, is the pediatric ophthalmologist who works in quite rural areas of Uganda. So KCCO runs screening programs in remote areas to try to find people with avoidable forms of blindness and provide treatment and follow-up for low vision services for any of the children that they find. The follow-up work so far has focused on things like follow-up surgeries that the children might need, provision of glasses, and magnification options. Some of the sort of like standard low vision kinds of services that are perhaps set up more for people with ocular visual impairment. They've noticed that there's been some challenges with the children who have had delayed access to that cataract surgery that they might have found at a screening program a little bit later. That when they're incorporated into the school systems, that the students aren't achieving to the degree that they would have hoped based on the visual acuity that they have after the surgery. So that's where I was kind of woven into conversations around whether there's something we can do to sort of, for a lack of a better way of saying it, maybe help teach these children how to see after they haven't had any experience with visual information. So we were looking at whether it was sort of practical challenge of whether we could improve low vision services and what that might look like. On the right here, this is Mahadeo Sukai. I've included a photo of him. Yeah, on the right, he's the VP of Research and International Affairs and the Chief Accessibility Officer at CNIB. He has absolutely astonishing research skills. If you look him up on PubMed, he has a lot of really high profile publications around, he does a lot of cancer research. So he's been on board with CNIB for the last few years now. And I had a chance to meet him just through that role initially. So yes, if you have a chance to listen to any of his talks or read his publications, I highly recommend it. He's a very interesting man who I have to say has become a really dear friend over the years. So he is, yeah, lovely. So it was interesting when he got woven into this because I was talking to him as a researcher, and as I was asking him about these kinds of questions around children who had delayed access to cataract surgery, he said at the time and said yesterday, I could tell you today, that was his experience it was his sort of medical history. So he was born with cataracts, dense central cataracts in both of his eyes, and he lived in an area where he didn't have access to treatment immediately and had to travel quite far to receive that treatment. So he both has the science experience and the experience of being excuse me, of having low vision, but also had this very specific and unique experience that we were talking about with KCCO. So he was really on board to be a part of this project. So to me, this was the dream team to start thinking about this idea of recovery from blindness. When I say it like that, it sounds very dramatic. And in fact, there have been a few stories about this idea of recovery from blindness or acquired vision that have kind of reached pop culture during our time. So you might have come across some of these cases. The first one was, or that was sort of within my lifetime. The first thing that I became familiar with was a New Yorker article that was published in 1995 by Oliver Sacks, about a man who was blind until about his 50s. And then he had a corneal transplant, which treated his ocular issues. Sacks, I don't know if you've read Oliver Sacks's work, but he's a wonderfully thoughtful storyteller. And he does just a really excellent job of articulating the challenges that this person faced. That article was made into a movie eventually called At First Sight, starring Val Kilmer. So it's possible you saw that back in the early 90s, or in the 90s, maybe probably in the 90s. I don't remember for sure. Another famous case that you may or may not have been aware of was that of Michael May. He was a relatively famous downhill skier who was blind from the age of 3. Kay, I don't know if you're here today, but when you told the story of your nephew and whether someone could ski, I really thought about Michael May. May holds the record for the fastest downhill skiing by a person who was completely blind. Apparently he raced, he was captured racing at 65 miles per hour. I don't know what that is in kilometers, but it sounds terrifying. He is also famous for getting a corneal transplant when he was 46, which allowed him to have partial vision after a lifetime of blindness. And that has turned into a book about his experiences. And he's also been the author on several publications from a visual neuroscience perspective that I've come across from an academic perspective as well. A really fascinating man. So I had heard these stories of kind of people being able to have access to ocular treatment for something that had caused their blindness after many years of having no vision. So heard these stories while I was in the middle of doing sort of neuroscience academic work. So this kind of caught my attention, like what's happening in the brain if the developmental period didn't include vision, and then vision is added to your experiences later in life. And this kind of a transition, I think, has captured the imagination of people from all kinds of different perspectives. It has a bit of a long and somewhat fabled history, I would say. There's some biblical stories of these transitions. There's philosophers like Descartes and John Locke who wrote about this. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Molyneux question. It's the question of whether a person could recognize a sphere and a cube strictly by sight if they had only been exposed to them by touch in the past. It was a philosophical question that's still discussed in philosophy circles now. And it has come up a little bit in the sort of visual neuroscience academic literature as well. It's a little bit more of an esoteric question. We'll touch on related things a little bit today, but I guess just to communicate that people have been thinking about this from lots of different perspectives. And I wanted to just highlight a keynote before I take you on a journey through the literature that we found. This idea of like curing or treating a particular aspect of diversity can be a really controversial one. We might think about deaf culture with cochlear implants being a part of the options available to children now and what the pros and cons are to that. Certainly talk to people who identify as autistic, and I think there's some really interesting reflection on some of the behavioral therapy that they received as children and those kinds of things. So I think diversity is just such an inherent part of human experience, and it really should be valued. So thinking about moving from no vision to some vision, for some sighted people who maybe haven't had experience with this, it can feel like a bit of a miracle. Indeed, it's kind of a classic one in the Bible, for example. But relying on other senses to understand the world is a different, not a diminished experience. I thought Amanda just did a really beautiful job of describing the important role of hearing and understanding the world. I just wanted to add one more story in here I'm giving way too many background introductory ideas here, but there's so many different ideas to cover. I had read an old fictional story ages ago called The Country of the Blind. I don't know if you've read this or not, but it's a story of a single-sighted person being immersed into a community of unsighted people. And in this case, in this context, in this social context, his vision is seen as a challenge, as a deficit. People sort of view these strange hallucinations that he has during the day as being a challenge, and the functional incompetence he seems to have at night as further deficiting his experience. So I think we want to keep these ideas in mind as we talk about this idea of treating treatable conditions later on in life, and what that means in terms of people's experiences of the world and their identity. Michael May's description, so this book, Crashing Through, which describes his experience of this, he didn't see it so much as a miracle. He knew that he was a competent whole person before he had access to, in his case, it was stem cell therapy for a corneal transplant. And he frames it much more as a new challenge or adventure to be able to be exposed to visual information. And I think that's where you see the subheading on his book there, The Man Who Dared to See. He says if he would have read the old literature, which I will start to describe to you in a minute, he might have chosen not to get the surgery. So it'll be interesting to explore that, but I think we just want to keep these ideas in mind as we delve in. So the approach that we took, so remember again, we're trying to solve this problem or shed some light on this problem, a very practical problem that KCCO is thinking about when Praskovia goes into the community, maybe finds a 10-year-old who has cataracts in both of their eyes that have been there perhaps since she was born. And then wondering whether there's something that we can do through the schooling system after that surgery to sort of help her use the vision after that surgery. So the approach that we took to look at what this experience might be like was to do a pretty structured scoping review of all the published literature. So we wanted to find any paper that was in the peer-reviewed domain that had at least one person who had at least vision within sort of light perception from birth, whose eyes were treated at least 2 years after they had 2 years after having no visual input. It could be much longer than that, but we were looking for cases where there was a bit of a delay between when they were able to access surgery. We wanted to also include only papers that had a visual scale beyond visual acuity. So we didn't just want clinical kinds of outcomes. I'm really interested in the brain. So what this means to me in terms of what visual skills are is a bit nuanced, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. But that was one of the criteria we used to make sure that we were looking at something maybe closer to functional visual skills like understanding motion and faces. So we searched several databases. We found about 600 potential papers that we screened against our eligibility criteria. These kinds of structured reviews are quite a lot of work, so we needed to bring another team member on board. So that's where Eloise became involved in this project. She helped us screen through all of these papers, and we ended up with 42 papers. And we went through each to look at how old the participants were when they underwent ocular surgery, and how long after surgery they were assessed, and what kinds of brain-based or cerebral processing skills were measured, and what their strengths and challenges were, hoping that we could have some more information when we looked at updating low vision education services for children after surgery. So I'm going to describe this as a little bit of a historical timeline in the first instance here. So on the screen, I'm going to present a little video where papers are going to pop up like popcorn along a timeline and kind of move around. And even for those who are fully sighted, this might be a little bit confusing. So don't worry about the screen if that is not resonating with you, but I will describe the important pieces of this. So currently I have a little legend on the left that just that has a list of the countries that participants came from in these studies, and each one of those are colored so that if you are engaging with this presentation with visual input, then those colors will represent the country in which these, I'm going to call them participants, because in this case, they're all reported on in studies. So I'll just play for the first chunk of studies, I think, that we found in chronological order. So for me, it was fascinating that the very first study we found was from 1728. And I just thought that was fascinating. We got this old paper, the PDF of it, the text was all different than I expected. It was really interesting to be able to read. And notably, 1728 is before we were able to do cataract surgeries in the way that we think about it now. So at that time, we weren't removing a lens from the front of the eye. At that time, they had a procedure called couching, which was sort of pushing the cataractous lens to the side, which gave a brief period of time where someone could see through that. I'm assuming, so most of the cases that I'm describing are going to be of cataract surgery. The two I described before were corneal transplants of some kind, but in most cases in this literature, it's cataracts being removed later. So when cataract surgery was just beginning to be used regularly in the medical community, then there started to be these papers describing this experience. So within the from 1728 to 1975, there was, I think, 8 papers published that we found about this experience. The very first one was, again, this sort of couching procedure where a 13 or 14-year-old boy was identified who had bilateral cataracts. And after the surgeon kind of pushed that lens out of the way, he could start to engage with the visual world. And this was the first account that I'm aware of a detailed description of what he could and couldn't see and what his experience was like after this surgery. One of the stories that stands out to me in this case is he describes being able to easily know his cat and his dog from touch and sound and all of the other ways that he would know these animals. But when he started looking at them for the first time, it was so difficult to tell one from the other. And Cheselton is the author of this paper, describes a moment where he's sort of holding the cat's face and is saying, like, one day I'll figure this out and know you by looking at you, not by these other senses. And for this patient, they really talked about how learning all of the new things that he saw was an exercise in just sheer memorization. And it was quite overwhelming, linking the things that he knew by hearing and by touch and by smell with these new visuals that he was now exposed to. And that sort of devoted attention to cataloging and memorizing was really hard work. Another study, a few centuries later, was in 1904 by a clinician called Latta. And that described a really, really interesting experience too, I think, of 2 siblings who each had surgery, I think in their 30s. And this one was really fascinating because they refer to Cheselton's study and they talk about how this idea of needing to memorize everything that's all these new visual things that are coming into your field, and then being able to catalog them, and how for Cheselton's patient that was really challenging and pretty overwhelming. But Latta describes that his patient found this exhilarating to us. Like he had an amazing memory, so he could catalog these things quite quickly and found that challenge kind of exciting. One story that I really like from Latta's paper, and I'm going to get carried away if I tell all these stories, so I'll try to stop it here. But the patient that Latta describes, he had some experience with, he was really confident, excellent at navigating, was a bit probably a difficult child to parent, I think. He's described as booking it around town, being so good at using his non-visual senses for navigating, and for working in the world. So he ended up working for a while as a florist and was really fat, but before he had the surgery. And he was so fascinated in what people thought was aesthetically pleasing. And because of smell and touch, he knew what all the flowers were and could sort of put together bouquets that people found visually appealing. And I think he really got a kick out of, or the way the story is described anyway, out of being able to sort of understand a lot of what his sighted community was describing through the other senses that he had. So they describe when he starts looking then at flowers after he's had the surgery on his eyes. Color was something that he could see immediately, and some of these colors he found amazing, and others very uncomfortable for him. They describe sort of a wave of nausea after seeing the color yellow. So I think his experience was a really fascinating one to read about, because he was, I suppose, so invested in the concepts of color and beauty, that his new experiences with this, he was really engaged in that process, and just seemed like a particularly intelligent, curious person. But even for him, there was a lot of challenges in that experience too. So anyways, I'm getting carried away, and it is really difficult actually to gauge any of your reactions because I can't see any of you. It is a funny thing talking into a void a little bit. I can see why having cameras on could be useful. But I'm gonna just kind of give an overview now of the studies that I've shown up to this point. So some of the key elements that are shared between these studies is that almost all of these were conducted by the surgeon who actually did the surgery on the eyes, working really closely with the person who is having the surgery done. Usually there was a close personal connection between those two people. And these studies generally described the highs and lows, the joys and challenges of kind of functioning with this new information within the first sort of 6 months or year of that experience. Now, after 1975, the papers changed quite a lot. So I'm just gonna keep playing the video. So we see this kind of popcorn of papers that are coming out if you're engaging with the presentation in that way. So between 1975 and 2005, to me, I feel like there was a big shift during this time. So there was a group of researchers in Japan who started working together and sort of forming little labs that were interested in this experience from a psychology kind of perspective. So this is the first time, so there's a little group of papers there that are colored purple to represent them being from Japan. Because none of these, or very few of these papers were translated into English, we needed to get another team member on board. So this is Goro. He's a vision scientist currently working in Japan, who helped us read all these papers and translate them and understand the perspective that they were coming from at that time. And these to me felt really fascinating because although some of the papers that we had found prior to this point were referenced quite often in current literature, this group of papers from Japan, they were really, to my mind, kind of left out of the academic picture. So it was really interesting to look at these with Goro. So the main shift here, I think, was that rather than it being clinicians talking about the kind of full extent of the experience that it was like for people after the surgery, now we're moving a little bit into labs that might be interested in particular chunks of that experience. And then looking at whether, so in the case of a lot of these studies from Japan, an example might be looking at how 3D shapes are understood. So they might take sort of a smaller portion of the visual experience and then work with people over a longer period of time. So over this part of history, we start seeing these stories of people who are being documented as they're going through this process of learning to see over a longer chunk of time on a narrower set of skills. So these papers from Japan really made up a really important shift from sort of quality of life into what we might call learning or rehabilitation, the more of an education perspective, or this is kind of, these were really interesting from the low vision services perspective to me especially. There was one paper that was published in Finland that was also really interesting. So this one of the authors on this was Leah from the Leah symbols. And she did just a beautiful job of describing this experience of someone learning some visual skills over a duration of time. And this whole group of studies, they started to shed more light on which skills could be trained and how that training might unfold, but also noticed how motivation was really tricky and how the experience could be quite overwhelming and how we might break an overwhelming large task down into smaller component parts, which I think is something that I'm really interested in. And probably this group would be absolutely fantastic at further unpacking with me. So I think from this point in history, there's lots of places we could go in order to think about how we might look at low vision services for the children that Praz and Elizabeth are working with in more rural areas in their context within East Africa. Now, at that point, the field changed in a way that I did not expect. So I'm going to show the rest of the history here. So again, I'm going to just keep playing this video where we see new papers pop up, and I'll sort of describe what's happening. So first, we start seeing these papers emerge where a lot of the participants are from India. And now, instead of having a single researcher working with a single patient or participant who's had this experience, now the number of people in these studies starts growing considerably. So now we have research groups with lots and lots of authors. If you're looking at the image on the screen, the little lines that are sort of making these webbed networks, those are the authors that are on papers. So early studies might have had one or two. And like I said before, those were normally the clinicians working with them. And then we start getting larger research groups that are interested in this topic that are now seeing lots of people. Another shift that happens is rather than having that close personal relationship that we started off with, and now in more recent studies, we often have people in labs that are based in higher income countries that are working with patients who have had delayed access to treatment in lower income countries. So these three networks that have emerged in recent years are separate from each other in some ways. There's not researchers that are kind of bouncing between these particular groups, at least as of 2021, when the end of 2021, we spent last year writing this up. So these three groups come from slightly different perspectives. They're interested in different parts of this experience. So one of them, it's the largest group of researchers that has done the most work and really initiated the shift in 2006. This is a group, the name of the project is Project Prakash, and it's run by Pawan Sinha. So he is based at MIT, but has ties to India, and they do all of their work in India. So they have a humanitarian and scientific collaboration where they provide treatment for people who haven't had access to it. And then they study how the brain then adopts this information. So to me, this was fascinating because this new wave of research was really looking more from the perspective of how the brain processes visual information rather than the sort of integrated patient experience. So one of the other shifts that we see at this time is, rather than papers that described the integrated experience of how having ocular treatment might impact the life in general and more functional skills, this new wave of papers was looking at very vision-specific skills. So a continuation of the shift that we saw from the 70s to the early 2000s. So most of these recent papers, and there are a lot of them, are looking at very specific visual skills. So the three groups are Project Prakash, which is MIT-based, working in India. Another group that works in India is based in Germany. It's Bridget Rotter's group. And then there's some new studies that are coming out of a group from Israel who work with children in Ethiopia. So if we're just checking the time, okay, I only have 15 minutes. So one of the things that we think about, if we're trying to think now, what do people who have had this experience, what do they actually see after? So I gave some examples of Cheslaton's patient and Lotta's patient, and then I sort of said that there's this range of visual skills that people may or may not, that have been tested. That people might find really easy immediately or might find really challenging after. So I want to try to summarize those skills a little bit for you, but how do we summarize those skills without sort of shared language for what it means to process visual information? So that's really a challenge in its own right. So what I wanted to talk about first was this breakdown between sort of functional vision and visual function. So this is something that I'm sure many of you in this room are really familiar with. So functional vision, I have some examples here, tend to be the more integrated skills and the sorts of skills that maybe were covered more often in the earlier publications that we found in our search. Whereas the visual function skills might be a little bit more about the sort of medical model or the different parts of the eyes and the brain that might work in order for people to be able to see particular things. So a classic example would be sort of visual acuity. At a clinician's office tells you a little bit about how the visual system functions, but the duration that a child can read for in a classroom tells you more about their functional vision. So we can think about that for the size of things, but we can also think about that distinction for things like motion, for things like face perception, and for all kinds of different categories. So to be able to think about how different visual skills are impacted, and especially because the bulk of the papers are working on specific visual skills, now all the recent papers, and they tend to be more from a visual neuroscience perspective, it's worth just having a quick look at the brain. So you're probably familiar with, hopefully, general lobes. So we know the frontal lobe does kind of executive function. The parietal lobe does a lot of motor and somatosensory sort of function. The temporal lobe does a lot of auditory language processing, and it has the hippocampus kind of embedded in there. So it does a lot of memory. So linking what we've seen before to new things that we see. And then the occipital lobe, which is in the very back of the brain, which is traditionally the more vision specific lobe. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this idea that was proposed back in the 80s and 90s by Milner and Goodall, and some other groups as well. The idea that there's kind of this parallel processing from the primary visual cortex into the dorsal stream, sort of vision for action, and into the ventral stream, which is more sort of vision for recognition. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this idea, but I came across it first in 2013, that there might be a lateral stream or a third kind of independent stream of visual processing that deals with more social kind of information. So lots of controversy about how true this is, the layers of complexity on this. But if we use this framing generally, I can sort of tell you the sorts of studies, the sorts of visual skills that were measured in these studies that I've described to you so far chronologically. So within the primary visual cortex, we might have things like, are these two circles the same color or different color? Are they the same size or different size? That's a sort of a primary visual cortex kind of task. And also something like this, how this is a contrast sensitivity function image. So how small can bars get together as they are along the x-axis, where you can still see them as bars rather than gray. And also how much contrast you need to see them. So those are kinds of visual skills that were measured in a lot of these studies. Recognition tasks, from simple tasks like whether something is round or whether something is a square or a circle, to more complex tasks where maybe shapes are overlapping or three-dimensional, to really more complicated recognition tasks like, is this a dog or a cat? Within the vision for action domain, we might do things like visual motor integration, how someone can reach for a cup or other things that are around, or things like motion processing. So the example I like to use for something like global motion coherence is, if all the leaves are blowing in the wind in all kinds of different directions, can we still sort of integrate that information to say what general direction we think the wind is going in? So those are skills that we might categorize into sort of space or vision for action. And then if we think about the social domain, some of the studies were looking at whether someone could tell a face from a non-face, or whether we could tell whether someone was maybe male or female, or what expression they were making. A few of the more recent studies looked at this task, which is a biological motion task. I've just started a video where there are several dots representing joints on a human body doing a particular action. And in some of the studies, they would show targets like this that had these point light sources at their joints to see whether newly sighted people could understand what those actions were. So if we have a really broad overview, so of what skills or sort of strengths of people quite close to having their eyes treated, and which things really pose challenges. It's hard to summarize because all of the papers use different tests and had different approaches to this. But I'm going to do my best to just give you a really broad overview of some of these things. So first of all, being able to tell whether stripes were horizontal or vertical, that sort of thing was relatively easy, whereas acuity was reduced. Even after surgery, if the eye was nice and clear, average visual acuity in the meta-analysis we did on all of these patients was still about 1 logmar, which is about 660 vision. So things aren't clear after this cataract surgery, and most people still fit into a category of severe visual impairment from a visual acuity perspective. But being able to see are two things the same color or different color, and learning to assign names to colors was something that came relatively easily. Also, whether something was larger or smaller was also something that could be done shortly after surgery. Being able to recognize relatively straightforward shapes was something that could be learned relatively easily, particularly by tracing around shapes or integrating integrating touch and vision at the same time to be able to link those ideas together. However, more complex shapes, overlapping shapes, separating foreground from background, and identifying more complex objects. Here, I use the example of maybe pets, very, very challenging. Even after years of experience with these things in a lot of cases. In terms of space and action, interestingly, a lot of people without visual experience still fell for a lot of the same optical illusions that you and I fall for, which is kind of that sighted people fall for, I should say. So that there's a lot of interesting discussion about how the brain processes those kinds of illusions. But certainly visual motor integration, navigation, and understanding integrated motion cues is definitely an ongoing challenge. Navigation in particular, there was a lot of cases that were very confident navigators and having that visual information actually made people lose some confidence in their navigation because the visual cues were quite confusing. And finally, in terms of social stimuli, being able to tell a face from a non-face was something that the studies highlighted as being a particular strength, whereas identifying facial expression, identifying who someone was, and gender, all of those skills were really challenging even years after the surgery. Biological motion, though, this example that I described with being able to just see joints highlighted. So if you make all the joint points visible in terms of the sort of low level acuity and contrast, and show someone even shortly after surgery a display of those joints moving. That just in the last couple of years, there's been some studies saying that kids that are around 10 or 11 getting surgery can identify those motions. And there's a really interesting theory, I think, that they've been posing about how being in motion allows us to, the bit of your brain maybe that's understanding our own motion and our proprioception, that we can use that when we see something moving in a way that we can't when we don't have that link between our own experience and what we're seeing visually. So I think the interactions between being in motion and seeing motion, I think, are really, really fascinating. So that's the main overview, and I've got 5 minutes, so I should probably stop, but I'll just leave you with a couple of thoughts about this, and hope we have an opportunity to discuss some of these things later. So in terms of what we can bring back to low vision services for Praz and Elizabeth, looking at what we do after surgery. So the key thing is setting appropriate expectations. I think going into a surgery like that, saying that, oh, your child's eyes will be clear after, can sometimes give a misleading impression of what the journey is going to be like for that child after they have that surgery. So hopefully studies like this, and if you're interested to read it, it's recently published, so you can look at the details. We can keep looking at this research to be able to provide appropriate expectations. Of course, everyone's different, but giving broad strokes for that can be helpful. Starting with achievable goals and building from that, and really being aware of noticing fatigue, motivation, and making sure that we're working on skills that are really relevant for the person's life are really, really important. And I also just wanted to make a note about equitable access to treatment. Cataract surgery is something that we know how to do now. It's a relatively straightforward surgery, but not everyone has access to that. So a lot of the current cases that I've described today are people who don't have access to general health care. So I think being able to really support organizations who are bringing that, like KCCO, Fred Hollows, Save a Canada, I know is another organization. The earlier that people can have surgery that exists, the more the brain can do all this work of learning to see when it's a more subconscious process. Just quickly too, there's a big gender divide. When we looked at which kids were coming in for surgery in the published papers, there's a lot more boys than girls. And I think that is still a part of society in a lot of pockets of the world. So really working on equity and gender equity in access to treatment. But also within low vision services and research, even the research has focused on what this information can tell us about the brain. In the last 10 years, it's focused on that more than it's focused on how we support these children after that surgery. So I think really amplifying the research on the lived experience of people in this situation, how we can support them moving forward. And I think there we can learn a lot from research in CVI that's really expanding over the last decade or so, and hopefully try to integrate some of those perspectives. Great, that's all I have for you today. I'll leave you with this video of a child who has just had surgery and is seeing for the first time. But there's no audio here, so it can just play. There's nothing specific I need to say about it. So Sue, if you need to interrupt me, now is the right time.
Thank you so much, Lisa. You know, your passion always shines through when you speak. Yeah, and I think I'm still in awe, really, just going, wow, so much amazing information. So thank you so much. I'm not going to do questions right now because I know a lot of people are going to want to email you to actually ask things, and I'm sure you will want to connect with others also. There's some things coming into the chat now just about how fascinating and awesome it's been. So what I will do is I'm going to hand over to Fia. And Fia will also want to bring Sharon, I believe, and perhaps Francis.
Thank you so much, Sue. Well, here we are. Francis, dear SPEVI members in Australia, New Zealand and Pacific Island countries, dear conference keynote speakers, presenters, sponsors and delegates. SPEVI Inc. will hold a special general meeting on the 1st of February. Frances Gentle has announced that she will step down from the position of co-president of SPEVI when the election of the nominated members of the new Committee of Management will be confirmed at this meeting. I know I can hear your gasps of disbelief and panic, even though your microphones are on mute. It has been my absolute pleasure and privilege to be co-president with Frances over the last 4.5 years. Her professionalism and expertise, as well as enthusiasm and great work ethics, working tirelessly to ensure all is done properly for the SPEVI community, have made this joint role a great pleasure. Sharon?
As the third president of SPEVI, I'd like to join Fia in acknowledging the inclusiveness that Frances has shown me during my time as president. I am awed and inspired by Frances's knowledge, initiative, and drive. Frances is a tireless worker, and I admire and thank her for this. I have immensely enjoyed and valued working with Frances. Kia ora.
As most of you will know, before it became a joint role, Frances had fulfilled the position of SPEVI president on her own in years past, as well as other important positions on the SPEVI Committee of Management. She has already been awarded a SPEVI Honorary Life membership for her tremendous service. Which brings me to the reason for this short deviation in the program, and I thank the conference organizers for allowing me this time. Dear Frances, the Committee of Management of SPEVI Inc. wants to perpetually honor your enormous contribution and long-standing service to SPEVI, as well as your lifetime of work towards education of people with vision impairment in our and other organizations. To this effect, we propose the installment of an award that will carry your name, the Frances Gentle Award. At the upcoming special general meeting, we will ask our members to confirm the installment of this award in your name to be awarded every 2 years to professionals working in the field of vision impairment education. In line with your strong advocacy for qualification and ongoing training and education, the attended award will consist of a bursary to be spent on professional development, a bursary of $250 to an early career educator and $250 for an experienced educator. Once approved, Frances, we invite you to help us establish the full details and criteria for future recipients of this prestigious award. Meanwhile, of course, until the special general meeting on the 1st of February, you remain co-president, and also, big sigh of relief by everyone, we are thrilled that as immediate past president, you will stay very much involved with SPEVI well into the future. And we are looking forward to a new term working together with you as a very much appreciated member of the Committee of Management. So, of course, please all join me in thanking and congratulating Frances.
Thank you. What a shock. Thank you, Fia and Sharon. I thought you were going to talk about Lisa's amazing presentation, and you've gobsmacked me. I'm going to be silent in shock, but I feel very honored, and perhaps it should be the Gentle Award. Take my first name away, and then everyone will think, oh, that's a gentle idea. All right, thank you very much.
Input already, so that's fantastic.
So I greatly appreciate the honor, and I look forward to being in touch and to work on it. Thanks,
Wonderful.
Sharon. What a trick. I don't know where you two got time to even talk about this with all the busyness of this conference. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll hand back to Sue. Thank you.
Thank you, Fia, and congratulations, Francis. And thank you for all you've done for SPEVI and blindness education over the years. We've got a refreshment break now for about 12 minutes. During that break, we will be sharing a presentation from our exhibitor Next Sense Institute and Macquarie University. And concurrent sessions will start sharp in 12 minutes time. So if you need to move to room 2, please do so during the break, and we will see you after your refreshment break. Thank you.